pawn that you would see black offer in most variations. Here, black has really ugly structure on the queen side, doubled c-pawns, isolated a-pawn, but he has a really juicy outpost for his knight in the middle of the board. And whoever races out, gets developed first, tends to get the advantage here. I've always slightly preferred white's chances. You get more space, you have the more fluid structure, but black, as Tanya said, very dynamic, and Hikaru clearly choosing this opening because of the match situation. It's part of his strategy to imbalance things and maybe even go for a win as black. Robert, what do you think of this plan?
Has these doubled isolated pawns on the c-file. We see the one next to the queen and the one sticking out pretty far on the c4 square. That said, as David was mentioning, the d5 square is firmly under black's control. There's not a white pawn that can challenge the square, and black's light square bishop will slide onto the fianchetto diagonal and take control over the board's longest line. So this is going to be good news for Hikaru. He can castle queenside. His king will be safe there despite the advanced pawns. And that d4 pawn is a bit tender in white's position. Double-edged position, chances for both.
Yep, definitely chances for both. But if this one does start to turn around, Hikaru's turning things in his favor, then Magnus might start to get nervous. A loss with white and the whole momentum, the whole initiative of the match would change. So Magnus here just developing his queen. Both sides staying very, very flexible.
White can also look at certain pawn breaks on the queen side with moving that b pawn one step ahead, and Magnus stops it forever with his Hikaru stops it forever with his last move. He jumps the knight forward. The one weakness that white had created with that a push is the b3 square. That is where the knight has headed. We've been talking about not making intentions clear with the black king, and look at Hikaru's last move. There is no queenside castling anymore. Hikaru is going for the attack, for the initiative along the b file.
So this does mean that both sides maybe intend to castle on the king side, and we'll see if either side can attack on that flank later.
And you were mentioning about clearing the way. One possible plan for black to do that is step up with the bishop, do that c6 square, David, and then you want to bring your knight. Let's see if we can bring up the analysis board in a bit, but it's a very nice idea.
Really interesting start. And yeah, did you expect this, Robert? I must admit, I thought Hikaru would just try and hold with black and press with white, but he hasn't been pressing hard with white so far this tournament. And wow, I think we're both shocked by this last move.
Yeah, you asked me my expectations. I wasn't quite expecting the pawn push. It does make sense. You're just saying, are you sure you want to castle kingside for Hikaru? Because if you castle there, white is going to launch an attack. Ready to bring the fight to Magnus, and he plays Tanya's move, bishop c6. The knight may slide out next, as we were showing in some previous lines. But perhaps Magnus Carlsen is going to take a page out of, was it Gukesh's book? Sliding his king one square over. Instead of castling, he will lift his rook later, but for now, he might just slide his king to the side. And he prepared this line, and look at Magnus. He's saying, all steam ahead. Let's go. Push that pawn forward. h5. Maybe that pawn will go forward even further to h6. Just try to create a dent in black's king-side structure.
And very often with these top players in chess, we see that their moves make sense when we look at them backwards. The plan that Hikaru's shown on the queen side, and we were talking about the knight jumping onto a4 to clear the b file, but Hikaru has something else in mind. He decides to force a trade-off and create an imbalance by exchanging the bishop for the knight.
Normally, you want to strand your opponent's knights on the side of the board, especially when you have strong bishops, as white does. But Robert predicts it correctly. You can allow a queen trade, but on your own terms. There, the black knights would have actually been surprisingly strong. Oh, wow. We've predicted it before. We've got two prophets here in the studio, Tanya and Robert, and the knight has jumped in, hitting this rook. If the rook moves, black does have the opportunity to slide back. Second time we've seen this, and as Tanya's also mentioning, the rook moves, the knight moves.
Knight b3 on the board, David. And while it's a start, the kind of position that he's gotten, extremely dynamic. Now, he gives a check. He gives a check, doesn't fall back with the knight. And look at the way he's playing, such aggressive moves. Every move is a piece forward. Just incredible stuff.
He is taking significant risks, however. He's playing very aggressively. But he has abandoned his king side, and Magnus takes the opportunity to step forward. Now, watch out. In any endgame, that white h-pawn is very close to promotion. The number of times I've seen Magnus promote his a or h-pawns after marching them forward this far, and only now does Magnus clarify the central tension, a decent share of the chances. OK, he's gone for this line, so we might well see, after bishop takes pawn, Magnus just recapture, just go a pawn up and threats against the black king. Let's see whether he finds a solution. Magnus didn't take that pawn yet. Surprising, I've got to say, but still looks like a decent position. He trades off bishops instead, and there we go. He beat me to it. I was about to say Normally, having an uncastled king is a problem because your rooks aren't connected. But here, it doesn't matter. White's rook is able to get up the board and start attacking across, and very effective.
Where if black defends it with the third piece, and I see that Hikaru is reaching out for his mouse, he's about to make a move, then white can pick up the c4 pawn. With the bishop, you pick it up with the knight, and the knight on b3 hangs. So he would have lost the pawn anyway, and instead, Hikaru decides to first bring his king to safety. But the big question always in these positions is, how safe is that king? Pinning the bishop. But can the knight be picked up on b3?
I think it can, and it most likely will. And the only question here for Magnus is which way do you capture? You could take this knight with your queen, allowing the black knight to jump in, and this is a superior version of what we looked at earlier for black, because suddenly both your rooks are active. Suddenly all of your pieces really, really well placed. And okay, looks like we've gone in the other direction. Sorry, just to backtrack. After bishop takes, I was expecting queen takes queen here, I've got to say, and heading into an endgame. But white would have had an extra pawn. Instead, Hikaru gives a really sneaky check, hitting the white king. Just in time, Magnus is able to go and block with his queen. His queen was also under fire, and now the bishop falls, and this is the current position. White's still a pawn up.
But with those pieces on the board, and we just see Magnus's rook slide across to b4, hitting the queen, protecting that extra pawn. I mean, that pawn is ultra well defended, and now Magnus continues to improve his other pieces. Watch out for Hikaru's king, but for now, he is quite active, trying to create threats against the white queen side. That's bad news for the black king. So Hikaru lashes out with his pawn push to a5. Look at how quickly, though, Magnus is responding. And Hikaru needs to have his moves ready quickly because he's down under a minute on the clock, and he remains a pawn down on the board.
The more hopeless it feels, David. And we've been discussing all these mating ideas, and Magnus steps up with his queen to the center of the board. I get the feeling that because of the mating nets that we've been showing, the black king just caged up on the king side, Hikaru might not have any better choice than to offer a queen trade, but the endgame is no better for him.
And you predicted it correctly, Tanya, and you're right, it's no better for him. Still just insurmountable problems, it feels like, with the black king on the back rank. Maybe if the black king was closer to the center again, an active king in the endgame, he would have some chances, but this one, I already see some trouble. There's some variations here, which I think will land on the board. Magnus is happy to just trade one set of rooks because that black rook is stuck.
Not about pawn quantity. I mean, that's not the only thing that matters. The piece quality is the more important element of this position. That's why Hikaru didn't even take the pawn. He understood that his knight would have actually been trapped on b2. You see, the knight has nowhere back to go. The rook has to stay in the last rank. Otherwise, there's a checkmate that gives white a free hand on the king side or in the center of the board just to trap that knight and go ahead and win at least a pawn and maybe more.
Yeah, and now, again, Magnus has that luxury of the move. OK, he brings his rook to the 7th rank, as Robert points out. This pawn is the first target. It's going to be the first one that drops. At some point, Magnus will happily just activate his king. The knight will always be trapped if it ever gets greedy. And, wow, Hikaru decides to go for it. I think there were no better options. This knight now stuck in no man's land. And even if you don't trap it, just go on the attack. There we go, Magnus Carlsen tying down. Look how passive these pieces are. Now he can reroute his knight into this juicy f6 square, and the king is going to be stuck in the corner as a bystander for the rest of the game.
The ideas that we're discussing for Magnus right now really rely on that e5 pawn, which is why we see Magnus's last move. He comes back with the rook to take away that key square for the knight, and Hikaru shifting back to the open file, again threatening the knight jump from b2 to c4.
OK, some tricks, at least some hope of salvation if you get your knight back into the game. I'm wondering now how Magnus proceeds. You're right, Tanya, actually. Not as easy as it looks at first glance. Still feels like it must be winning somehow, but some work to be done.
Magnus will have to go for, and Hikaru, see, rook f4, here come the moves, here they are all going, and the white king goes up. Well, look at Hikaru go. He's just chasing the king around, trying to force it to a suboptimal square, but the f7 pawn, at the end of the day, that still remains a target, and Hikaru down to just 11 seconds.
And it should be the end, and he's going for it. Hikaru drops back. Very clever defensive move yet again. What a champion he is, holding on here for dear life.
Nihilistic in the Twitch chat saying Psyduck versus Hikaru.
I love it.
Applause. That is amazing.
And, OK, he's shifting focus now. White's rook threatening to deliver a nasty check, a mating threat there on the back rank, which Hikaru blocks yet again. It feels like Magnus is throwing everything at Hikaru, but Hikaru is always swatting it away. He always has an answer. And suddenly the black knight is threatening two pawns simultaneously. Magnus takes one, but OK, it does feel like Hikaru's slightly closer to saving this game now, especially if he can go and capture that white H pawn, that thorn in his side.
And it's heading there. That's exactly what he does. He moves that knight, attacking that h pawn, but you can pick up the f7 pawn currently. Because if you pick it up with the knight, then you don't win that h6 pawn. So white does have that option. Magnus goes for it, picking up a pawn, defending his own, and I'm expecting Hikaru to move the rook along the f-file. And what happened?
No, this game is still going. Yeah, he still had enough time, but barely enough time.
Oof.
And that's the problem, is the knight is kicked out. So the white knight defends the pawn. The black knight can't stay there forever. And don't forget that white has this passed pawn on the queen side. That a3 pawn still exists. You're going to start pushing that one up the board and threatening the black king with checkmating ideas.
Hikaru looks very unhappy with his position, shaking his head there.
He looked ready to resign. He nearly got out of his chair a moment ago. Now, Magnus has to be slightly careful where he puts the king. You don't want to put the king on a passive square. There we go. Out into the open, out towards safety. And I think Hikaru, body language, he's ready to resign. The white king's just going to attack these pieces. And now the black king is the one that is doomed. Checkmate is coming. Black's king all alone. And Hikaru does eventually throw in the towel.
Wow, Magnus Carlsen strikes first in the grand final. He